Hey.
Alright y'all, now before we get into the video, as you can see from the intro, new logo, new updated channel logo. I think it came out pretty clean. It took me a couple of days to make. I'd love to hear what y'all think about it, or if you care at all. I don't know what y'all think. So anyway, back to the actual video. The idea of star players resting has been an ongoing topic of discussion in the NBA for quite some time now. So much so that the NBA went as far as to implement a new player participation policy at the start of the season. And if you were unaware of this policy, or if you just need a quick reminder of what it was, basically, this new policy targeted star players in the NBA, and a star player, according to the NBA, is any player who was on an All-NBA team or made an All-Star team in the prior 3 seasons. Now, quick side note that I also found interesting in doing research for this video, but that also includes this year's current All-Star game. So, for example, let's say, a player makes the All-Star game for the first time in their career. For the rest of this current season, they now also apply for this star player role in this player participation policy. So anyway, the rest of the guidelines go as follows. Unless a team demonstrates an approved reason for a star to not play, then they have to follow this little list of rules that no more than one all-star can be unavailable for any given game. Star players should be available for all nationally televised games. Teams must also balance the number of one-game absences for star players between home and road games. Teams must refrain from any long-term shutdowns for star players. And if they are resting a healthy player, they must ensure that that player is present at games and visible to fans. And I could get into more antics about the pros and cons of this policy. I personally kind of just understood it from the day it came out as a way for the NBA to try and please the media companies that they sell their games to, like TNT and ESPN. And they basically are using this as a way to ensure for their next upcoming TV deal that these companies will still want to pay for NBA games because, at the end of the day, this league is all about money. And a lot of people didn't like that these policies kind of felt a little entertainment-y. And what I mean by that, especially, in reference to that last point about making sure that healthy players that are resting are present at games and visible to fans, it just felt a bit, zoo animal-like to me. So, yeah. Anyway, up until this point in the season, I'd say that the rules have been a bit of a success. I think it's also helping that there just haven't really been, at least this isn't based off stats or anything or any facts, but to me personally, just based off vibes, it feels like there have been way less injuries up until this point in the season than in previous years. I can really only think of 2 teams that have been hammered by injuries. One, obviously the Memphis Grizzlies, and 2, to a lesser extent, but still pretty horribly, the Cleveland Cavaliers. And even when looking at the top 50 players in the NBA sorted by points per game, there are really only a few players that stand out as having significantly less games played than the average player. You have guys like Kyrie, who's played 24 games, LaMelo Ball's played 17 games, Anthony Simons is at 18 games, Tyler Herro's at 20 games. I know off the top of my head, Zach LaVine has missed some time. But outside of those just handful of guys, most players are playing a high percentage of games. Obviously, they're still missing a game here and there for rest. That's to be expected, but that also, I think you have to blame the NBA schedule makers for those missed games, because that's another ongoing topic in the NBA that continues to just be a problem for some reason. And that's the idea of back-to-backs and just poor scheduling for either wonky flight trips and just stuff like that. Anyway, the point I'm trying to get at is all of these things have come together and star players are playing more games than they have in recent seasons, and there is one stat that is extremely out of line as a result of this. And shout out to Kofi for pointing this out. He was the first person that I saw make note of this on a TikTok. So if you know Kofi, if you've probably seen him rant about the Pistons at some point this season, but shout out to him. But there is a stat called margin of victory, and this stat basically takes the average, either however many points a team wins by or however many they lose by. They take that result from every game, average it together, you get margin of victory. And if we look at the 2022-2023 season, you'll see that there were only 2 teams that had an MOV greater than 5, with the Boston Celtics and the Cleveland Cavaliers. And on the flip side of that, there was only 1 team that had an MOV worse than -9, and that was the San Antonio Spurs. Now we take those same benchmarks and we apply them to this season so far, and there is a much longer list to look at. For teams with an MOV greater than 5, we have 7 between the Celtics, the Thunder, the Sixers, the Timberwolves, the Clippers, the Nuggets, and the Bucks. And for teams with an MOV worse than -9, the Spurs are now joined by the Wizards, Blazers, Pistons, and Hornets. And so the main thing to take away from this group of data is that blowouts are happening at a much higher rate this season than last season. And what Kofi was trying to point out is he believes that this new player participation policy is the culprit for why we are having more blowouts. And blowouts are a bad thing for the NBA. It's the worst thing that can happen, especially when it is a night of primetime games, either on ESPN or TNT. There was one night a little bit ago, I think it was about a week ago. The 2 primetime games on TNT were the Celtics getting blown out by the Milwaukee Bucks, and then the Lakers getting blown out by the Suns. That night also featured the Thunder beating the Trailblazers by a score of 139-77. And I don't think you need me to tell you why blowouts are bad. Star players aren't on the court as much. It's a bunch of bench players. There are no stakes in the game. Everyone is just kind of going through the motions. And I definitely agree with Kofi to some extent that these new policies are bringing about more blowouts because more star players are playing in more games. And when that's the case, these good teams are playing even better because they have more continuity with, again, their star players playing more games. But I think it's also pointing out just how much of a difference there is between those top teams with all these star players and, you know, good offenses and good defenses, and the bottom of the bunch where you have teams like the Pistons and the Hornets who just have not much talent. They don't have any schemes. They don't play as a team. And it's becoming very noticeable how much of a difference there is between the best and the worst. And so I've been trying to think of a potential solution to this new blowout problem because it's definitely becoming a problem. I'm seeing more and more people tweet about how the NBA is slowly becoming the National Blowout Association, or I personally prefer, as Noah Terranova put it, the National Backshot Association. But I'm not quite sure what the NBA can do because it's not even like these teams at the bottom of the league are tanking per se. They just have stripped their teams of all sorts of talent and cohesion to the point that they just very rarely have a chance to compete with this sudden influx of really, really good teams at the top of the league. And on top of all of this, the NBA also just released a report a couple of days ago that basically is claiming that there is no correlation between load management and injury risk. Now, an important thing to note that this report also says is that just because they didn't find a correlation between less injury risk and load management doesn't necessarily mean that load management doesn't help. All this report is saying is that the results from their analysis does not suggest that missing games for rest or load management, or simply having longer breaks between game participation, that doesn't reduce future in-season injury risk. And this is a really interesting thing for the NBA itself to come out and say, because at this point it just really seems like they are pushing this anti-load management agenda that all started back with the introduction of the player participation policy at the start of the season. I'm also just very curious to see what teams' feedback is to this report as well. You know, if they actually will listen to it and start load managing less, or if the NBA will just continue to, you know, take away back-to-backs and make the schedule easier for teams to comply with. There are a lot of routes this thing could go. Now, one last fact I'll leave you with from this article to wrap this video up that I personally found more interesting than the rest of the article itself. Now, the group also went back through each decade of NBA history and tried to find the average of games missed per season by star players, again using that same definition of players who are on All-NBA or All-Star team for the last 3 seasons. And they found that in the 1980s, these star players missed on average about 10 games per season. In the 1990s, the number basically stayed the same with a 0.2 increase. Then in the 2000s, the number jumped up to 13.9 games. Then 2010s jumped up to 17.5 games, and is now peaked in the 2020s at almost 24 games missed on average. So as we all know, the NBA is not a perfect product. Like most things, when you increase one thing, there's going to lead to a decrease in other things. That's just how most things in life work. And so this might just be something that NBA fans have to deal with. As more star players continue to play more games, we might just have to live with the result that we're going to have more blowouts throughout the season. But the hope is that once we get to down the stretch and playoff time, that the good teams are playing other good teams, and that will lead to less blowouts, whereas opposed to this regular season where we have good teams playing bad teams night in and night out, and that's when the blowouts usually occur. Either way, I just kind of felt like sharing all of this with all of y'all, so if you enjoyed, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, all of those good things, and I'll catch y'all in the next one.